So the last section in this module is going to deviate a little bit from the book, and we're going to talk about acid-base balance. Right? This is important for normal function at rest, and then it is critical for performance during exercise. So what do we mean by acid-base balance? Ultimately, the body tries to maintain homeostasis by keeping a normal pH slightly basic of a pH of 7.4. Right? We can have movements in this, so we can go slightly to the left, slightly to the right to become more basic, which would be known as alkalosis, or more acidic, which is acidosis, right? What we're primarily going to be concerned about as far as this class is the shift in a decrease in pH to a shift closer to 7, and how do we actually handle that, right? We know that we've talked about that pH of blood will go down with exercise, but how do we prevent it from just plummeting and keeping it in this normal physiological range of about 6.8 or so in blood? So first we'll start with, where does it come from, right? So one of them is, of course, lactic acid, which then rapidly dissociates into a lactate ion and a hydrogen ion, which is now an acid and can increase acidity. We talk about this in the lab. I'll make this very short point since we haven't introduced it in this class. And if you haven't taken the lab, and we'll spend a little bit more time on this. But just so you know, lactic acid is produced as by lactate dehydrogenase, pyruvate into lactic acid, but lactic acid rarely exists in the body. Indeed, it rapidly dissociates almost instantly into its basic form, lactate, and a hydrogen ion. So lactic acid produced from metabolism. Lactate is actually what's found because of this rapid dissociation into lactate and its hydrogen ion. Right? We also know and have talked about that the ATP, the breakdown of ATP for muscle contractions, releases hydrogen ions, which of course add to the acidity. And then last but not least, carbon dioxide, which is increased with exercise because it's the end product of the oxidation of fat. Right? You remember that each carbon molecule in that glucose, so 6 carbon molecules, we ultimately produce 6 CO2s, and the same happens for fat. And although we didn't talk about it, protein is the same, right? So each time we break these down, we produce CO2, and as we talked about in the previous module, CO2 can combine with water to make carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then dissociates to create our hydrogen ion and our bicarb, right? So those are our 3 primary sources of hydrogen ions during exercise. So why do we care, right? I mean, obviously the blood, right? We don't want to die, but there's also the ability that even slight changes can impair performance, right? So one is hydrogen ions can attach to key enzymes in our metabolic pathways, altering the structure and function of these enzymes so that they no longer work appropriately, and then metabolism slows down. If based on our overarching principle of metabolic supply and demand, if our supply decreases, then the power output to meet that demand is also going to decrease. It's also interesting to note that a high level of hydrogen ions compete with calcium for binding sites on troponin C, to be specific, and when they do this, then they inhibit and delay muscle contraction. So the blood has several different buffers. So we have our plasma proteins, which have some ability to kind of group and accept hydrogen ions. However, they have a low concentration, significant at rest, but minimal buffering capacity during exercise. So we're going to somewhat ignore those. At hemoglobin, we of course have lots of hemoglobin, as we talked about yesterday. It is accepting of hydrogen ions. That's one way we transport CO2 in a different form to the lungs for it to be exhaled out. And since we have a whole bunch, of course, this is a huge buffer during rest, and as I mentioned, great way to get rid of CO2 and minimizes the changes caused by CO2 being released by oxidative metabolism at rest. And the last but not least is we have a bicarbonate ion, right? This is, I would say, the most important buffer in the body because, again, it can it can take the reaction that we talked about earlier of how we produce hydrogen ions from carbon dioxide, and we can now go back the other way, right? So our bicarbonate can go back to carbonic acid, which then in the lungs can be taken as CO2, and we can then remove CO2 from the system as opposed to just binding and buffering. We can actually kick CO2 out via expiration. We'll talk a little bit more here. There's this specifically, again, the idea that pulmonary ventilation removes hydrogen ions from the blood by this bicarbonate reaction. So we're not just buffering, binding, and keeping it from decreasing pH, we're actually removing the acid from this, right? So our hydrogen ions in the blood, again, can become carbonic acid. Then by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, we can generate CO2 again, and therefore get rid of that through expiration. Right. So increased ventilation results in an increase in carbon dioxide exhalation. This reduces our partial pressure of CO2 and our hydrogen ion concentration, ultimately causing an increase in pH. Right. If we, for some reason, would have a decrease in ventilation, then we get a buildup of CO2, which then causes a pH to decrease. Right? So if we look at the mechanisms of how we buffer, we have blood proteins, to sum this up, and hemoglobin during exercise. So this is good at rest, bad for exercise. Right? At exercise, what happens is we're primarily going to use bicarbonate buffering system, and we term that respiratory compensation, right? These hydrogen ions stimulate the carotid receptors that then cause an increase in ventilation. And again, as we talked about, there's a reason that threshold of ventilation is equal to lactate threshold, right? These are tightly correlated, so when acidity goes up, we then compensate by respiration through that way. So again, very short video, but just wanted to remind you and kind of spell it out, even though we talked about it earlier on in the videos. So I hope you've enjoyed the respiratory section of this class.